trained to be trained for bombing operations against the enemy. You know, you really have three main categories. You have the bomber operations, you have fighter operations, and you have reconnaissance operations. And I went into the Bomber Command of the South African Air Force. After my initial training in South Africa, I did my OTU, which is an operational training unit, in Kenya. We were then based at a place called Nanyuki, which was right on the equator. Very interesting, flying around there, but very, very dangerous because of Mount Kilimanjaro and Mount Kenya, where the clouds used to build up to depths of 10,000 feet. And our aircraft were not the best at that time. And that was a very hazardous experience doing the operational training in Kenya. When I completed that stage, I was posted to what was known as the Desert Air Force in North Africa. The situation in North Africa, as in many other areas, particularly on the Russian front, where the Germans made tremendous progress, the situation in North Africa was very precarious. The Allies really lost, the Brits and the South Africans lost a lot of men, a lot were taken prisoners of war. The Germans wanted to drive through into Egypt, control the Suez Canal, into Palestine, to give them access to the oil fields in the Middle East. But fortunately, the line was held at El Alamein. The Battle of El Alamein took place started on the night of the 22nd, 23rd October, 1942. And that was the first significant Allied victory in World War II. Up to then, really, there were retreats and defeats and heavy losses. The command of the army the commander of the army at that time was General Montgomery, who became a very famous general, and the chief of the Air Force was Air Marshal Tedder, a great Air Force man. And this combination of Army and Air Force in the Middle East was really a new situation. I'll never forget the night of the 22nd, 23rd October, when the Allies when our forces started the offensive. The artillery bombardments were so tremendous that the whole skyline was just ablaze. And from then on, the Allies really had control of the situation. You know, the German commander was a very famous general by the name of Rommel, who was a great commander of the Panzer tank divisions, very brilliant strategist, very brave man, and he and his Panzer tank divisions were really a formidable force. But we were bombing them day and night. We gave them no respite. And the Germans started retreating. And so from Egypt, they retreated into Libya, and then into Tunisia, and then into Malta, and then into Sicily, and then into Italy. And the Allied forces were harassing them all the way. We really gave them no respite. Unbeknown to us, the Allies had broken the German code, the famous German code which was known as Enigma. And once they had broken that code, they knew of all the German ship movements. Now that was important because Rommel's tanks depended on fuel. And the objective of the Allied air forces were to bomb every tanker which we knew was leaving a port at a certain time on their way to North Africa. And so his tanks were really immobilized. They were neutralized. But they put up tremendous resistance. And as I said, from Libya to Tunisia to Malta to Sicily and to Italy. And at that stage, that is really where my first tour of operations ended. You know, you fly so many missions, and then you get a break. And I had a month's leave to go down to South Africa. I've been away really then for 2 years. During my period in North Africa, I was seconded to the Royal Air Force, the RAF. One of the RAF squadrons had heavy losses, and they requested the South African Air Force if they would agree to attach some of the South Africans to this particular squadron, which had these heavy losses. And I was one of the men who was seconded. I still remained in the South African Air Force, but I served with the RAF.
Excuse me. Thank you.
And during that period, I served with the RAF for a period of about 7 months. It was a very interesting experience because there were Canadians and Brits and South Africans and Australians. Really a very interesting mixture of air crews. And as I said, my first tour of operations ended when the Germans had already withdrawn into Italy. On my return to South Africa, on a month's leave, I applied to go to England on heavy bombers. I had, prior to the war, met quite a few of the German refugees who had come to South Africa before the war. But as you know, the trouble in Germany started building up from 1933 onwards. And of course, that was before the Holocaust. But when one heard of the hatred of the Germans towards the Jews and what they were doing to the Jewish communities in Germany, one was really filled with a feeling of revenge. And during my period as a member of the South African Air Force, I was really motivated by one thing: to kill as many Germans as I possibly could. And I suppose as a Jew, our feelings were somewhat different to the non-Jews who were in the squadrons at that time. But nevertheless, I think that most of the Jews who knew what was going on in Germany, and of course news of the losses during the war, the situation in Russia was absolutely disastrous. The Germans made tremendous advances into Russia. Their losses were tremendous. As a matter of fact, Stalin at the time pleaded with the Allies to start the battle in the Middle East earlier than October. But General Montgomery made it clear to Churchill he would not start the offensive until he felt he was really ready to drive the Germans out of North Africa. And as I said, the Battle of El Alamein, which was really a crucial battle, started in October 1942. When I got back to South Africa, as I said, I really had applied to go on to heavy bombers bombing from England over Germany. But the South African Air Force at that time set up a new command, which was known as Coastal Command. Coastal Command was equipped with flying boats, and their job was to hunt the German submarines, to do the convoy escorts, to do naval reconnaissance. Their job was to hunt the German submarines, to do the convoy escorts, to do naval reconnaissance. And I was attached to Coastal Command at that time. It was a very interesting experience. All our flying was on flying boats. We really lived on the sea. I had my initial training in South Africa, and then in Northern Ireland, and then we were posted to Scotland, where we did our first operational flying over the North Atlantic. Then we had to transfer flying boats from the UK to India, and then from India we set up the main base of our squadron was in Durban, South Africa. And from there we operated in the Indian Ocean and the South Atlantic. From England, of course, we were flying over the North Atlantic. And so, when Germany surrendered in May 1945, our squadron was then geared to go to the Far East to fight against the Japanese. And when we were all ready and packed up, the atomic bombs were dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima in August 1945, and the war came to an end. So that was really my experience in broad terms in the South African Air Force. As I said, I had 5 years of service, which included about 7 or 8 months in the Royal Air Force. Perhaps I can just digress from the main story to add a few interesting points. When we were trained in the South African Air Force, and now I'm talking about the Jewish community in South Africa, who could have envisaged that that training would be so important for Israel? Nobody could have dreamt that the war was going to start in 1948. After the war, World War II, like all the other servicemen, we were trying to rehabilitate ourselves. Some of the guys returned to studies and to their homes and their businesses and so forth. And in 1947, of course, there was the United Nations Declaration in November, and it was clear that there was going to be a war in the Middle East. Sorry, sir. Hi, Shalom.